A mother came to her son's wedding and saw something strange on the bride. The truth shocked everyone. Watch to the end and share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching this video from? The sun dipped lazily behind the horizon, casting a warm amber glow through the lace curtains of Adiah's living room. Dust motes danced lazily in the fading light, and the soft tick of the grandfather clock filled the room with a steady rhythm. Adiah sat curled in her armchair, a worn photo album resting on her lap. Her fingers, weathered with time, traced the edges of a photograph, the last image of her daughter, Lily. Adiah's face, though lined with years of sorrow and resilience, held a softness that only a mother's love could shape. She was a woman of quiet strength, her spirit forged in the fire of loss and the bittersweet grace of survival. The photograph captured a fleeting, perfect moment. Little Lily, 3 years old, her tiny arms outstretched toward the camera, her dark curls tousled by the wind. Adiah could almost hear the echo of her daughter's laughter, light and carefree, the kind of sound that carves a permanent home in a mother's heart. On Lily's slender neck was the distinctive birthmark, a crescent-shaped blemish no larger than a thumbprint. It had always reminded Adiah of the moon, a mark from the heavens, unique and precious. But that laughter had been stolen from her. The memory surged, vivid and raw, as if it had happened only yesterday. The beach had been crowded, the air thick with the smell of salt and sunscreen. Children's shrieks of joy mingled with the roar of the waves. Lily, with her small bucket and shovel, had been building sandcastles at Adiah's feet. For a moment, just one fleeting moment, Adiah had turned to answer her husband's call. When she looked back, her daughter was gone. The panic had been instant, cold, and suffocating. She had screamed Lily's name, her voice torn and desperate. Strangers helped her search, their faces blurring into a collage of concerned expressions. The lifeguards scanned the waves, and police arrived to sweep the shoreline. Hours bled into days, and days into weeks. They combed every inch of the coast. Flyers with Lily's bright smile plastered telephone poles and storefronts. But the ocean gave no answers, and neither did the world. Lily had vanished, swallowed by the cruel, indifferent tide of fate. The weeks turned to months, then years. The search efforts waned, and sympathy from friends turned into uncomfortable silence. Even her husband, broken by grief, couldn't stay. Their marriage, fragile under the crushing weight of loss, shattered into silence and separation. Alone, Adiah remained anchored in the empty nursery, unwilling to move Lily's toys, her clothes, or her favorite stuffed rabbit. She lived in a house haunted by echoes, where every creak of the floorboard was a ghost of her child's footsteps. But Adiah refused to surrender to despair. She continued to search, not only through newspapers and missing persons boards, but also through hope and belief. She whispered to the wind every night, praying that somewhere, somehow, her daughter was alive. Then came Ethan. 2 years after Lily disappeared, Adiah made a choice born of both grief and longing. She visited the local children's home, a small, worn building filled with the laughter and heartbreak of those waiting for families. She had not gone looking for a replacement for Lily. Such a thought was impossible. But her heart, shattered and bleeding, craved to give love that had nowhere to go. She found Ethan sitting alone on a window seat, his legs drawn up, his chin resting on his knees. His hair was the color of sunlit wheat, and his eyes, the hue of a clear summer sky, were watchful and guarded. He was 5 years old, a child already acquainted with loss. His parents had died in an accident, and he had no one. When their eyes met, something shifted, softened. Ethan did not smile, but his gaze held a flicker of recognition, as though he sensed the hollow ache in her heart mirrored his own. "Hello," she said softly. He hesitated, then whispered, "Hi." The social worker later warned Adiah that Ethan was quiet, often withdrawn, and found it hard to trust. But Adiah, with the certainty of a woman who had walked through the fire of sorrow, knew that trust was something you earned, not demanded. She visited every week. She read him stories, brought him small treasures, a book, a soft scarf, a wooden airplane. Slowly, the cracks in his silence opened. One day, he tugged at her sleeve and asked, "Will you come back tomorrow?" Adiah's throat had tightened. "As many tomorrows as you'll have me," she promised. When she adopted him, she told him the truth. "I lost my little girl. I don't want to replace her, Ethan, but I have so much love inside me and I want to share it with you." Ethan's small fingers found hers. "Okay," he whispered, and so he became her son. He filled the hollow spaces in her heart with new laughter, new joy. He never called her Mom immediately. Too big a word for too small a boy who had lost so much. But one night, years later, he had sleepily mumbled it into her shoulder, and the tears that followed tasted of both sorrow and healing. Years passed. Ethan grew into a man. He was bright and determined, with a passion for building. Bridges, houses, futures. His heart was golden, his spirit steady. He was everything Adiah could have hoped for in a son. Through him, she learned that love could not only heal, but also grow anew. Yet, Lily's absence remained a silent ache, a shadow that never fully left. The photo album in her lap now felt both heavy and sacred. She closed it carefully and placed it on the side table. The clock chimed softly, 8 times. Evening had settled fully, wrapping the room in twilight. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. A smile tugged at her lips despite the memories lingering in the air. The caller ID read, "Ethan." Adiah answered, and his voice, warm, familiar, and tinged with something else, something bright, poured through the line. "Mom," he said, and the warmth in that single word was a balm to her soul. "I have something wonderful to tell you." The soft hum of the phone lingered in Adiah's ear as she listened intently to her son's voice. There was something in Ethan's tone, a barely contained excitement, a tremor of joy that made her heart flutter with anticipation. She hadn't heard him sound like this in years, not since he was a child unwrapping Christmas presents or winning his first architecture competition. "Mom," he said, his voice rich with warmth, "I've met someone." The world around Adiah softened, and her lips curved into a smile. She felt the unmistakable surge of maternal curiosity and joy. "Oh, Ethan," she breathed, "tell me everything." Her son chuckled softly, and Adiah imagined his face, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, a trait he'd carried since childhood. "Her name is Naomi," he said, his voice holding that tender note that only came from a heart deeply touched. "She's incredible. Smart, compassionate. She's a doctor, Mom. She cares for people with everything she has." Adiah felt her heart swell with happiness. "A doctor," she repeated, her voice filled with pride. "She must have a beautiful soul to choose a path of healing." "She does," Ethan said, and Adiah heard something more profound in his voice, an intimacy, a certainty. "She's everything I never knew I was missing." A soft warmth filled the room, as though the love her son felt had traveled through the phone line, settling into her heart. It was the kind of joy that only a parent could feel, seeing their child not only succeed, but truly live. But behind her happiness, a subtle thread of curiosity pulled at her thoughts. "Ethan," she ventured, "how long have you been seeing her?" "A little over a year," he admitted, his tone sheepish. I know. I should have told you sooner. But I wanted you to meet her in person, not just through a call or a photo. She's special. You'll see." Adaya's eyebrows lifted slightly. A whole year? He had kept this from her for that long? But the excitement in his voice dissolved any potential disappointment. If he had waited, it was because he wanted the introduction to be meaningful. "And when do I get to meet this extraordinary woman?" she teased. The pause that followed carried a different kind of excitement, tinged with anticipation and something more. "Actually," Ethan said slowly, "sooner than you think. Mom, we're getting married." The words fell into the quiet room and bloomed, vibrant and full of promise. For a heartbeat, the world stood still, and then joy exploded in Adaya's chest like the sudden bloom of spring after a long winter. "Oh, Ethan," she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes filling with happy tears. "You're getting married?" "Yes," he said, his voice brimming with happiness. "I asked Naomi, and she said yes." Adaya pressed her fingers against her lips to stifle the tremor in her voice. "My boy," she whispered, "you found your heart's home." "We have a date," he continued, his excitement spilling over. "And we want to have the wedding at home, if you're okay with that." The thought sent a wave of warmth through her. "At home?" she echoed, and a smile spread fully across her face. "Of course, my love. Nothing would make me happier." There was relief in his laugh. "Thank you, Mom. I know it'll be a lot of work, but—" "Nonsense," she cut in with gentle firmness. "It will be a joy, my greatest joy." The call stretched on for another half hour as they discussed dates, guests, and plans. Adaya's heart felt as though it had expanded beyond her chest, filled to the brim with the happiness of knowing that her son had found love, found family, found everything she had always wished for him. When the call ended, Adaya sat for a long moment, the room now quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock. She felt the warmth of her son's joy lingering in the air, wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. Her gaze fell on the photo album once more, and her smile softened. She ran her fingers over the worn leather cover, a quiet thought brushing against the edges of her heart. "Lily, my darling, your brother's getting married. I wish you could be here to see how wonderful he's become." Adaya's heart carried both joy and longing, the dual melody of a mother who had loved and lost, and yet found love again. The next day, she began preparations. She cleaned the guest rooms, measured the garden space for a wedding tent, and visited the local florist to reserve spring blooms. She selected silver and ivory tablecloths, picturing the tables set beneath the big oak tree where Ethan used to play. She even began drafting a small speech, wanting to welcome Naomi into their family with words from the heart. But through the excitement, a subtle curiosity lingered, unspoken and unanswered. Why had Ethan not shown her even a single photograph of Naomi? Adaya brushed the thought aside, trusting her son's choice. She was certain that when she met Naomi, everything would fall perfectly into place. The wedding day, and the meeting that would change her life forever, was fast approaching. The wedding day dawned in a soft, golden haze. Sunlight streamed through the canopy of oak trees surrounding the garden, dappling the grass with warm, flickering patterns. Adaya stood at the edge of the scene, her heart swelling with a blend of excitement and nostalgia. The air was alive with the scent of fresh flowers, roses, peonies, and jasmine, their fragrance weaving through the gentle murmur of guests gathering in their finest attire. Soft music from a string quartet floated in the air, delicate and hopeful, a perfect overture for the day. Adiah wore a graceful gown of deep blue that flowed softly around her, the fabric catching the light with every movement. A silver bracelet, a cherished keepsake from Ithan's childhood, adorned her wrist, a silent reminder of their journey together. Her chest felt full, her pulse quickened by both joy and anticipation. Today, her son would start a new chapter of his life, and today she would finally meet the woman who had captured his heart. She scanned the crowd, her eyes instinctively searching for him. And then, there he was. Ithan, her boy, now a man, standing tall and radiant in a perfectly tailored suit. His face, always a window to his heart, glowed with a happiness that could not be contained. Adiah felt her throat tighten with emotion. She moved toward him, her heels brushing softly against the grass, and he turned, his eyes lighting up at the sight of her. "Mom," he greeted, his voice warm, his smile wide. She reached him, and without hesitation they embraced. His arms were strong, familiar, and filled with love. She pressed her lips briefly to his cheek. "You look so handsome," she said softly. Ithan chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "And you," he replied, "look like the most beautiful woman here." Adiah felt a ripple of warmth at his words, but even through her joy, her curiosity stirred. There was still someone she had not yet seen. She drew back slightly, searching his face. "Where is she?" she asked gently, her eyes glinting with anticipation. Ithan's smile softened into something more profound, more tender. He turned his head, and Adiah's gaze followed. Then she saw her. A vision in white, the bride glided toward them, her gown flowing like liquid silk around her, the sunlight catching the soft pearls embroidered into the fabric. She moved with a natural grace, each step elegant yet unpretentious. Her skin, a rich, warm hue, glowed in the daylight. Her eyes, deep, dark, and full of soul, met Adiah's, and in them Adiah glimpsed something familiar, something she could not yet name. The young woman's face was radiant, her smile luminous. She approached with a warmth that felt both immediate and intimate, and her voice, when she spoke, carried a gentle, musical timbre. "It's such an honor to finally meet you," the woman said, and there was sincerity in every syllable. "I'm Naomi." For a heartbeat, Adiah was still. Then her lips curved into a smile, and her voice, soft and warm, replied, "Only the bride wears white, so you must be the one who has stolen my son's heart." Naomi's eyes sparkled, and her smile deepened. "I hope I've earned it," she said with a quiet sincerity that struck something deep within Adiah. Adiah reached forward, taking Naomi's hands into her own. The young woman's palms were soft, warm, and steady, yet the contact sent an unexpected jolt through Adiah's chest. Her thumbs brushed over Naomi's skin, and in that fleeting motion the world seemed to tilt. Her eyes froze on Naomi's neck. A birthmark. Adiah's breath faltered. The shape was distinct, a crescent, resting softly against the curve of Naomi's skin, just below her collarbone. The same mark, the mark she had once kissed 1,000 times on her little girl's neck. Her world seemed to constrict into a narrow tunnel, the sounds of the wedding, laughter, music, the rustle of leaves, fallen away into a muffled haze. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a wild, uneven cadence. She felt her fingers tremble against Naomi's. Naomi's brows drew together, her smile flickering into concern. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice gentle, uncertain. Adiah's throat felt dry, her voice a whisper that barely escaped. "It's nothing," she said, pulling her hands back carefully, though her eyes could not leave the birthmark, but it wasn't nothing, it was everything. Her knees felt weak, but her mind raced. How? How could this be? Her logical self screamed coincidence. Birthmarks weren't unique. But her heart, her mother's heart, roared something else, something impossible but undeniable. The eyes, the warmth of her smile, and that mark, so singular, so intimately etched into Adaya's memory. The world around her felt surreal, as if she had stepped into a dream or a nightmare. Her son's fiancée, the woman he loved with all his heart. Could she be? No, she couldn't. But what if she was? Adaya's pulse pounded in her ears. The photograph in her mind, the memory of Lily with her wild curls and that tiny crescent mark overlaid itself onto the face before her. The resemblance, no longer vague, felt sharp, undeniable. Yet fear tangled with her hope. She wouldn't say anything now. This was Ithan's wedding day. She could not let her turmoil, her storm of doubt and longing, shatter this sacred moment. But the need for truth burned in her chest. She had to know. Swallowing hard, Adaya steadied her voice and smiled, though the edges of it felt brittle. "You're beautiful, Naomi," she said softly, "and I'm so grateful to welcome you into our family." But her eyes, her heart, and her soul whispered a different question, one she could not voice. "Who are you?" The rest of the wedding day unfolded in a swirl of joy, laughter, and celebration. Guests raised their glasses to toast the happy couple, and the air was filled with the sound of clinking crystal, soft music, and warm conversations. But for Adaya, everything felt muted, as though she were watching the event through a veil. She smiled when spoken to, she laughed at the appropriate moments, but beneath her composed exterior, her heart and mind were in turmoil. The birthmark. That crescent-shaped mark on Naomi's neck had branded itself into her thoughts, and no amount of cheer or champagne could blur its image. Her mother's instinct screamed with a voice she could no longer ignore. This can't be a coincidence. But what if it was? Adaya felt the cold whisper of doubt. She had seen that mark last on a child who would now be a woman. Could she be so desperate, so grief-stricken that she was imagining connections where none existed? Yet the resemblance in Naomi's eyes, the shape of her smile, each observation felt like another crack in the wall of reason. And what of the way her heart had lurched upon meeting her, that immediate, inexplicable familiarity, like finding something long lost but never forgotten. But if this impossible suspicion was true, Adaya's chest tightened. The implications were devastating. If Naomi was her daughter, her Lily, then Ithan's love, their impending marriage. She felt her stomach twist at the thought. It would mean disaster. It would mean heartbreak. But she wouldn't destroy this day on a whisper of doubt and a memory. She needed the truth, and she needed it without tearing her son's world apart prematurely. As the reception carried on, Adaya moved through the gathering with a singular, concealed purpose. She sought Naomi, not to confront her, but to understand her, to listen, to know. She found her standing near the garden fountain, the setting sun casting a warm glow across her face as she spoke to one of Ithan's friends. Adaya approached, her voice soft but steady. "Naomi," she said with a smile that belied the storm within her, "may I steal you for a moment?" Naomi turned, her expression lighting up. "Of course," she said, excusing herself and moving beside Adaya. "Everything all right?" Adaya's eyes searched hers, deep and warm, pools that seemed to hold stories untold. She kept her voice light, though her heart pounded. "I realized," she said gently, "that I know so little about you. Ethan has told me how wonderful you are, but I'd love to hear more from you, your family, your childhood, if you don't mind sharing with your future mother-in-law." Naomi's smile softened, but a flicker of something, sadness perhaps, crossed her eyes. She shifted slightly, her fingers brushing the stem of her wine glass. "I don't mind at all," she said softly, "but there's not much to tell. My early childhood is mostly a blank." Adia's breath caught, but she kept her expression calm. "A blank?" Naomi nodded, her voice carrying the faintest tremor of old wounds. "I was adopted. My parents, Rachel and Thomas, found me when I was very little. I don't remember anything from before them." The world around Adia seemed to tilt slightly. She felt her pulse quicken, but she steadied it with effort. "Found you?" she echoed, her voice carefully neutral. Naomi's gaze softened as if recalling a familiar story. "Yes, they told me they found me alone on a beach when I was about 3 years old. They tried to find my family, went to the police, checked the news, but no one ever came forward. So eventually, they adopted me and gave me a home. They've been the most wonderful parents." Adia felt her fingers tighten slightly on the clutch in her hand. The beach. 3 years old. A lost child, never claimed. Her heart pounded so fiercely she thought it might shatter her ribs. A moment of silence stretched between them, and then Naomi's expression grew concerned. "Is something wrong?" she asked softly. Adia felt her breath falter, but she managed to smile. Tight, fragile. "No," she whispered. "Nothing at all. It's just, it must have been hard for you, not knowing where you came from." Naomi's eyes darkened with the shadow of old uncertainty. "Sometimes," she admitted, "I wonder who they were. Why no one came for me. But I had Rachel and Thomas, and they loved me as their own. That's always been enough." Adia felt her heart break in 1,000 directions. She wanted to reach out, to touch her, to hold her, but the truth remained a fragile thing. Without certainty, without proof, she dared not speak the wildfire in her chest. Instead, she placed her hand gently over Naomi's, her voice soft and filled with something too vast for words. "You are truly a blessing," she said, and the sincerity in her voice made Naomi's eyes glisten. The moment passed, but the storm inside Adia raged on. When Naomi excused herself to rejoin Ethan, Adia's composure wavered, her hands shaking slightly. Her son, his bride, and the impossible truth that threatened to tear their lives apart. But she could not, would not, speak without knowing. A new resolve hardened within her. She needed answers. And the only people who could give them were Naomi's adoptive parents. The opportunity presented itself sooner than expected. Later that evening, as guests drifted between conversations and toasts, Adia noticed a couple standing quietly at the edge of the gathering. They observed Naomi with the unmistakable affection of parents. Adia's pulse quickened. Without hesitation, she approached. "Excuse me," she said, her voice composed but soft. "You must be Naomi's parents." The woman, Rachel, turned with a warm smile. She was a woman in her 60s, with kind eyes that mirrored Naomi's gentle spirit. "Yes," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Rachel, and this is my husband, Thomas." Adia shook their hands, her palms slightly cool, her heart a drumbeat in her chest. "I'm Adia," she introduced herself, "Ethan's mother. It's a pleasure to finally meet you." "The pleasure is ours," Thomas said with a friendly nod. "You've raised a wonderful son." Adia smiled tightly, the warmth of their kindness twisting the knot in her chest even further. She hesitated, then said softly, "Would you mind if we spoke privately for a moment? There's something personal I'd like to ask." A glance passed between Rachel and Thomas, brief, questioning, but they nodded. Adiah led them to a quiet corner, the noise of the reception softening into background murmurs. She took a slow, steadying breath, then, her voice low but firm, she asked, "Forgive me for the intrusion, but was Naomi adopted?" The change in their expressions was subtle but unmistakable. Rachel's eyes flicked with something between surprise and guardedness. Thomas's lips pressed into a line. There was a beat of silence before Rachel spoke, her voice carefully measured. "Yes," she said slowly. "She was. But how did you know?" Adiah's chest felt tight, her next words trembling on her lips. "She told me," she said softly, "that you found her on a beach when she was a child." Thomas's brow furrowed and his eyes sharpened with an edge of caution. "That's true," he confirmed, his voice steady but questioning. "We found her alone. She was so small. The police searched for her family, but no one ever came forward. So we adopted her." Adiah's hands clenched together, her knuckles white, her voice barely above a whisper. Did you ever find out where she came from?" Rachel's expression softened into something almost apologetic. "No," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "We searched, but her past was a mystery, and we chose not to press her with questions as she grew older. We wanted her to feel safe in the family she had." The air seemed to thin, and Adiah felt her composure cracking under the unbearable weight of a truth she was afraid to fully confront. Her voice, raw with suppressed emotion, slipped out before she could stop it. "My daughter went missing 20 years ago. She was 3 years old. We lost her on a beach." Rachel's lips parted in shock. Thomas's eyes widened and the color drained slightly from his face. Adiah's voice broke, trembling and fragile. "She had a birthmark, a crescent, just like Naomi's." The silence that followed was shattering, and in it the world seemed to stand still. Rachel and Thomas exchanged a glance, one filled with unspoken understanding and something else, fear. Finally, Rachel's voice, soft and uncertain, broke the silence. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Adiah, we never knew. We never imagined." Adiah's breath hitched, and she felt the hot sting of tears at the edges of her vision. Her hands trembled as she clutched them tightly to still the storm within her. "I need to know," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, her heart raw and aching. "I need to be sure." The question hung in the air, both unspoken and deafening. Could Naomi be my daughter? The air felt heavier than ever as the echoes of the conversation with Naomi's parents settled into Adiah's bones. Her heart, raw and trembling, carried both hope and terror. She had walked back into the reception on unsteady legs, her mind spinning with questions that refused to settle. Her gaze sought Ethan and Naomi, who stood together beneath the garden's archway, their silhouettes golden in the soft glow of the string lights. The way Ethan looked at her, pure devotion, the kind of love a mother prays her child finds, sent another sharp pang through Adiah's chest. If she is my daughter, Adiah's thoughts raced, then what we are walking toward isn't joy, it's heartbreak. But there could be no assumptions. She needed more than memories, more than instinct. She needed the truth. That night, when the last guests had drifted away and the garden stood quiet beneath the silver eye of the moon, Adiah made her decision. She couldn't carry this uncertainty a second longer. The next morning, she asked Ethan and Naomi to meet her privately. The warmth from the wedding festivities lingered, but when they arrived, the gravity on Adiah's face melted the joy from the room. "I need to speak with you both," she said softly, her voice measured but trembling under the weight of what she was about to say. It's important." Ethan's brows drew together in concern. "Mom, what's wrong?" Adaya's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in her lap. She turned her gaze to Naomi, her heart pounding. "Naomi," she began, her voice catching, "I need to ask you something very personal, and I need you to trust me." Naomi's expression softened with a flicker of confusion, but her voice was steady. "Of course. What is it?" Adaya's throat felt tight, but she forced the words through. Would you be willing to take a DNA test with me?" The air in the room thickened, and a shadow of confusion and alarm flickered across Naomi's face. "A DNA test?" she echoed, glancing toward Ethan, whose expression had darkened into one of deep concern. Adaya felt the tremor in her chest growing, but she pressed on. "I know this must feel strange and intrusive, but there is something I must know, something that could change everything." Naomi's gaze searched Adaya's, and what she found there, fear, sorrow, and something unbearably fragile, made her voice softer. What is it you're trying to find out?" Adaya's voice broke as she spoke the words she had held back, the words that burned her from the inside out. I lost a daughter. 20 years ago. She was 3 years old. She disappeared on a beach." Her voice trembled, her eyes glistening. You were found on a beach." Naomi's lips parted, her breath catching as the pieces began to fall together. "I saw your birthmark," Adaya continued, her voice cracking under the weight of the confession. "It's exactly like hers. I can't explain it, but every part of me is screaming that you might be—" Her voice broke completely, and the last word slipped out like a prayer. "Her." The silence that followed was absolute. Naomi's hand fluttered to her neck, fingers brushing against the familiar crescent-shaped mark. Her face, pale and wide-eyed, showed a storm of confusion, fear, and something deeper, something that felt like recognition. Ethan's voice, tight and bewildered, broke the silence. "Mom," he said hoarsely, "are you saying you think Naomi is—" Adaya turned to him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I don't know, Ethan," she said, her voice pleading, "but I need to know for her, for me, and for you." A sharp, painful silence fell. Then Naomi spoke, her voice soft, tremulous, and edged with something that sounded like a whisper of lost dreams. "I don't remember my life before Rachel and Thomas," she said quietly. "I've always wondered where I came from, who I came from. I never imagined—" She faltered, emotion catching her breath. "If there's a chance," her voice steadied, "I want to know, too." The decision was made. The next morning, they went together to a private clinic. The walls were sterile, and the air carried the cold scent of antiseptic. The whole process took only minutes, a simple swab from inside their cheeks, but it felt as if they had placed their entire lives on that thin cotton tip. As they left the clinic, the world felt unnaturally loud. The rush of the wind, the distant honk of a car, the chatter of strangers. It all felt intrusive against the fragile, trembling silence they carried within them. The doctor had told them the results would take days. Days. Time became an enemy. The first night was a blur of sleeplessness. Adaya lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning through every memory of Lily, the sound of her voice, the feel of her small hand in hers, the little giggle that used to fill their home. She had spent 2 decades imagining her daughter's face, what she might look like now, how her voice might have changed. And now the possibility that her daughter had been so close, right in front of her, felt like both a miracle and a curse. But what if she was wrong? What if she was hoping for something that would only bring devastation? The thought that followed was more terrifying. And if I'm right, what will happen to Ethan and Naomi? Naomi spent her nights in a whirlwind of her own. She lay awake beside Ethan, her heart heavy with both hope and dread. She had always felt a piece of herself was missing, a hollow space she could never fill. Rachel and Thomas had given her love, a home, a life, but the question of where she came from had lingered like a shadow. Now that shadow had a shape. But with that shape came fear. If she truly was Adiah's daughter, her throat tightened. What would that mean for Athan? Would it mean that the life they had dreamed of together was over before it even began? And yet, even as fear gnawed at her, something else whispered softly from deep within. The way Adiah had looked at her, the tremor in her voice, the way her touch had felt, familiar, known. It was the kind of recognition that transcended memory. It was something primal, something only the heart could understand. Ethan was silent, withdrawn. He spent his days buried in work, but barely accomplished anything. His thoughts were a labyrinth of confusion and fear. He had waited his entire life to find someone like Naomi, someone who saw him, truly saw him, and loved him wholly. He couldn't imagine his life without her. But now, a terrible question loomed, monstrous and unthinkable. And yet, beneath his confusion, he felt something deeper. He saw how Adiah looked at Naomi, not with suspicion, but with the eyes of a woman who had found something she had been searching for her entire life. And he saw how Naomi, in turn, responded, not with fear alone, but with yearning. Part of him, an impossible, fragile part, wanted it to be true. Because if Naomi truly was Adiah's daughter, it meant she was family in the deepest, most profound way. But at what cost? The waiting became unbearable. Every day felt like a lifetime, and every moment stretched with the ache of the unknown. Adiah spent long hours walking through the house, her fingertips brushing old photographs and faded memories. She paused before Lily's photo, the one she had carried through all these years. She touched it, her lips parting in a whisper. "Lily, my heart, are you coming back to me?" Finally, the phone call came. The results were ready. The doctor's voice, professional but gentle, invited them back to the clinic. The drive was silent. Adiah sat in the front with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Ethan and Naomi sat in the back, their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles were white. The clinic was too bright, too cold, and as they were seated in the consultation room, the air felt too thin to breathe. The doctor entered, holding a folder that felt as though it carried the entire weight of the world. He sat down, his expression unreadable, and opened the file. His voice was calm, clear, unshakable. And when he spoke the results, the world broke open. The air in the consultation room felt frozen in time, heavy with the unbearable tension of the moment. The soft rustle of the doctor's papers sounded deafening in the silence. Adiah felt her pulse thundering in her ears, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Ethan and Naomi sat opposite her, their hands interlocked, two souls bracing against a storm that none of them could see, but all could feel. The doctor, a middle-aged man with a calm and practiced demeanor, lifted his eyes from the folder and spoke, his voice steady but carrying the weight of finality. "The DNA results are conclusive," he said, his words slow and clear, each syllable a hammer against the silence. "Adiah, you are Naomi's biological mother." The world collapsed and expanded all at once. Adiah felt her heart stop, and then, in the next second, it shattered into a million pieces and reformed, burning and beating with something too vast, too raw to name. She gasped, a sharp, broken sound, and her hands flew to her mouth as tears, hot and uncontrollable, surged down her cheeks. "My daughter," she choked, her voice breaking under the weight of the truth. You're my Lily." Her body trembled, her heart pounding with disbelief and the searing, impossible joy of the words she had yearned to say for 20 long, barren years. Naomi's face was a canvas of shock, her lips parted, her eyes wide, and for a long, breathless moment, no sound escaped her throat. Then, slowly, the realization dawned, and her voice, when it came, was small and fractured. "You're my mother?" Adiah couldn't speak, could only nod, her face crumbling under the torrent of emotions. Her trembling hands reached forward, tentative, afraid that the world would break apart if she dared touch what she had lost. And then Naomi moved. A sob tore from her throat as she surged into Adiah's arms, and they collided in a trembling, heart-wrenching embrace. The dam of 20 years broke, and both women wept. Great, heaving sobs that carried the agony of loss, the confusion of fate, and the uncontainable miracle of reunion. Adiah clutched her daughter, with all the strength her body could muster, her fingers digging into Naomi's back as if anchoring herself to reality. She wept into Naomi's hair, the scent of her, familiar and unknown, filling her senses and sealing the fractures in her soul. "I found you," Adiah sobbed, her voice trembling and raw. "Oh, my sweet girl, I found you." Naomi's voice cracked between gasps of air, her body shaking with the intensity of her tears. I didn't know. I didn't know." "You're here," Adiah whispered through her tears. "You're here." The room, the world, time itself faded. There was only the reunion, painful, joyful, and so profoundly deep that it felt like the earth itself had shifted to bring them back together. But then, a single, horrifying realization struck through the wave of joy, and it hit Naomi first. Her body stiffened in Adiah's arms, and she pulled back slightly, her tear-streaked face now twisted with dread. Her wide, terror-filled eyes found Ethan. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her body shaking for an entirely different reason now. If she's my mother, then you—" Her voice broke, and she couldn't finish the sentence. A shock wave of horror crashed into the room. The warmth of reunion shattered into cold, brutal fear. Ethan's face had gone utterly pale, his breath shallow. His lips parted, but no sound came out. His eyes, those clear blue eyes, locked on Naomi's, and they were filled with devastation. "No," he said, his voice hollow, cracked from his throat. "No, that can't be." The unbearable implication hung in the air, thick and monstrous. If Naomi was Adiah's biological daughter, if she was Lily, then Ethan and Naomi, the dream they had built, the love they shared, was a tragedy in disguise. Naomi's body shook violently, and she stumbled back, her eyes wide with horror and agony. We can't," she gasped, her voice breaking, her entire frame trembling under the weight of the unspoken. "Ethan, we're... No!" Ethan's voice cracked, loud and desperate, his hands raising as if he could physically push the horror away. "No, that's..." His voice faltered into something shattered and broken. "That can't be true." The world spiraled, and the floor felt like it had vanished beneath them. Adiah, her own body still trembling, felt the earth splitting open beneath her. She could hardly breathe through her tears, her voice desperate and pained. I didn't know," she cried, her voice a pleading wail, as if she could tear the agony from the air. "Ethan!" Her voice cracked and her body shook violently. "My son!" The word son was a fresh knife through Ethan's chest. His knees felt weak, his face hollowed with devastation as he whispered, "Then, Naomi is—" His voice died, and then silence. A silence so thick and so heavy it felt like the earth itself had stopped turning. The silence was broken by Naomi's sob, a strangled, broken sound, and she turned, her voice thick with devastation. "Ethan!" she gasped, her face shattered with agony. I love you, but—" Her voice cracked as she tried to breathe through the impossible anguish. "But we can't." Her legs buckled, and she collapsed to her knees, her hands covering her face as the world shattered around her. Her body heaved with sobs so raw they sounded like her heart was breaking aloud. Ethan stood frozen, completely still, his eyes distant and hollow. His entire world had been ripped away in a single instant. The future he had dreamed of, the life, the family he had wanted with Naomi, was gone. But his lips parted, something surfacing from the depths of his soul. A whisper. A truth he had carried but never spoken aloud. In the devastation his voice, broken but clear, finally spoke. "We can—" Naomi's sobs faltered, and her hands fell from her face, her eyes wide with confusion and pain. "What?" Ethan's voice shook, his body trembling with the force of the moment, but he held her gaze, and in it was a truth that fractured the air. "We can," he repeated, his voice hoarse but sure, "because—" His chest heaved, his voice trembling. I'm not Adiah's biological son." The world stopped. Naomi's breath caught, her tear-filled eyes freezing on his. What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan's face was pale, his eyes raw, his voice strained but steady as he forced the truth to the surface. "I was adopted," he said, his voice shaking with every word. "Adiah is my mother in every way that matters, but not by blood." A gasp, sharp and shattered, escaped Naomi's lips. Her eyes, wide and disbelieving, searched his face for a lie, for any sign of confusion, but there was none. Adiah's voice, fragile and trembling, broke into the space. "It's true," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, her hands still shaking. "I adopted Ethan. After I lost Lily, I loved him as my own, but he was never my child by birth." The room, so full of devastation, shifted, the air cracking with the weight of revelation. Naomi's chest heaved, her hands trembling as the impossible walls of their nightmare crumbled. Ethan's voice, soft, pleading, raw, broke through the veil of agony. "I'm not your brother," he said, and his voice cracked with both sorrow and desperate, aching hope. We're not family by blood." The silence that followed was not the suffocating one of horror, but the silence of a world holding its breath. Naomi's lips parted, her breath unsteady, her eyes filled with disbelief and something else. Hope. Her voice, trembling and fractured, barely escaped her lips. "You mean—" Ethan's body shook with the force of his emotions, his eyes locked on hers, his heart bared, open, and raw. "We can be together," he whispered. "You're not losing me, and I'm not losing you." A single, shuddering sob tore from Naomi's throat, a sound of breaking and healing at once. Her body, so taut with grief, collapsed into relief so profound that it knocked the air from her lungs. Adiah, still weeping, felt the earth shift beneath her, not into darkness, but into light. She had not only found her daughter, she had not lost her son. The storm had passed. But it had left everything changed. The room, still heavy with the echoes of raw emotion, felt impossibly still. Adiah's heart pounded in her chest, the force of the revelations crashing over her like a tidal wave. The unbearable tension, the agony of loss, the horror of impossible love had snapped, leaving in its place something fragile and trembling, hope. Naomi's eyes, wide and still glistening with tears, remained locked on Ethan. Her lips quivered, struggling to form words, her entire body shaken from the weight of what she had just heard. "You're not her biological son?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, as though afraid that saying it aloud might shatter the delicate thread of salvation holding them above ruin. Ethan's throat worked as he swallowed, his voice tight and raw. "No, I'm not." His eyes, filled with pleading and pain, held hers. "Adiah adopted me when I was 5 years old. She raised me. She is my mother, but—" His voice cracked. "We share no blood." Naomi's chest rose and fell in sharp, broken breaths. Her hands trembled at her sides, her entire being trembling under the sudden and violent shift from despair to something else. Something she couldn't yet name. Adiah, her face still streaked with tears, spoke softly, her voice carrying the warmth and weight of a mother's love. "It's true," she said, her voice trembling but sure. "Ethan came into my life after I lost Lily. I chose him. No, he chose me. I've loved him with every piece of my heart from the moment he became my son." Her voice softened, thick with emotion. "But he is not my child by birth." The truth hung in the air, shimmering with unbearable tension and sudden, impossible relief. Naomi's lips parted, but her voice faltered. Her gaze broke from Ethan, turning to Adiah, confusion and longing mingling in her eyes. You adopted him," she echoed, her voice shaking, her mind racing. Adiah nodded, her eyes gentle and overflowing with emotion. "Yes. After I lost you, my heart was in pieces. I didn't think I could survive the emptiness. But then I found Ethan, or perhaps he found me, and he became my son, not by blood, but by every bond that truly matters." Naomi's lips trembled, and for a moment, the agony of the last hours pressed into her chest, so sharp it felt unbearable. "So, we aren't—" Her voice fractured on the last word. "No," Adiah whispered, her voice soft but firm. "You're not brother and sister, not by blood, not in any way." A long, shuddering silence fell, a silence not of despair but of transition, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then Naomi's knees buckled, and a strangled, gasping sob escaped her throat, not from sorrow, but from the unbearable release of it. Ethan moved instantly, his arms catching her as she collapsed into him, her body racked with violent, trembling cries. The relief was so profound it felt like breaking. Naomi clung to him, her fingers twisting into his shirt, and her voice, cracked, raw, escaped her lips in a whisper filled with both agony and something more powerful than words. "I thought I lost you." Ethan's arms tightened around her, his face buried in her hair, his own body shaking. "You'll never lose me," he choked, his voice hoarse and fractured with emotion. "Never." Her sobs, heavy and broken, were matched by his, and together they clung to each other, their bodies shaking from the aftermath of a devastation that had, in a single breath, turned into salvation. Adiah, her own face wet with tears, watched them, her son, her daughter, and felt something in her heart break, and then heal. The impossible had happened. She had found her daughter, and she would not lose her son. The weight she had carried for 20 years, the empty ache where her child had once been, was suddenly, impossibly gone. Replaced by a new truth, one she never could have dreamed of. They were a family, all of them. But through the crashing waves of emotion, Naomi's body, still trembling in Ethan's arms, stiffened. A new fear, a different terror. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "but if you were adopted—" Her throat worked, her voice trembling as her eyes, red and glassy, lifted to meet his. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question was raw, and in it was more than confusion. It was the pain of not knowing, the ache of secrecy. Ethan's arms around her tightened briefly, then softened. His voice, when he spoke, was hoarse and thick with emotion. "Because," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, "because it never mattered to me. You've always known who I am, but you didn't need to know how I came to be." His voice trembled. "Adiah is my mother. She has always been my family. And I—" His voice cracked and he closed his eyes briefly. "I didn't tell you, because I was afraid." Naomi's eyes, glassy and vulnerable, searched his. "Afraid?" she echoed. Ethan's breath was unsteady. "Afraid that if I told you," he said, his voice shaking, "it would change how you saw me, that you would see me as something less, as someone without a real family, without roots, just a boy who didn't belong anywhere." Naomi's eyes, wide and filled with tears, softened with something so fierce, so raw, it stole the breath from her chest. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick, "you are the only person I've ever known who belongs everywhere, because you build family with your heart." Her voice, trembling but strong, filled the space between them. "And you are my home." Ethan's throat worked and his eyes, glassy and raw, burned into hers. "Naomi," he whispered, her name a prayer. A soft, choked sound escaped from Adiah's lips, a mother's gasp at witnessing a love forged in the crucible of every conceivable hardship. She had feared losing them both, feared that this revelation would tear their world apart. But what she saw now, what she felt, was the exact opposite. They were not broken, they were forged. And then Adiah spoke, her voice hoarse but filled with a mother's unshakable truth. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice trembling, "I have loved you every day since the moment you became my son. I chose you then, and I choose you now. You are my child, not because of blood," her voice cracked, "but because you are my heart." Ethan's body shook, his eyes squeezing shut as his mother's words, the words he had always known but never dared to need, crashed over him. He turned from Naomi and fell into Adiah's arms, his body breaking with sobs that carried everything: fear, love, and the unbearable, life-given truth. Adiah's arms, strong and trembling, folded around him and she cradled her son against her heart. "You will always be mine," she whispered, her lips brushing his hair as tears fell freely down her face. "Nothing will ever change that. Nothing." Naomi, watching them, her mother and the man who had been raised as her brother but was not, felt her heart swell and fracture and mend all at once. Adiah turned, her eyes soft, her face open with both love and something Naomi had yearned for her whole life: a mother's gaze. And with a soft, trembling whisper, Adiah reached a hand toward Naomi, her voice fragile with hope and wonder. "My daughter," she said, the words breaking in whole at once. "My sweet, lost Lily," her voice caught on a sob. "Can I—" Her voice broke, and then, with everything in her soul, "Can I hold you?" Naomi's knees gave, and she collapsed into Adiah's arms. The sob that tore from her chest carried everything: 20 years of loss, of wondering, of longing, and it melted into the warmth of a place she had never known but had always yearned for: home. Adiah's arms, strong and trembling, closed around her daughter for the first time in 2 decades. Her lips pressed against Naomi's hair as she wept openly, and through the tears she whispered over and over, "I've found you, I've found you, my baby, my sweet girl, I've found you." Ethan, his chest shaken with the force of everything, looked at them, his family, and in that moment, something deep, something ancient, something whole, settled. The room, which had been a chamber of heartbreak and revelation, now filled with something else. Love. Not perfect, not without pain, but true. They were not what they had been before. They were more. As the storm of emotions ebbed, as their sobs turned soft and their trembling bodies stilled, Adiah, holding both her son and her daughter, felt something bloom inside her that she thought had died long ago. Her family, lost and broken, was found. And together they would face whatever came next. The air felt different now, thicker but lighter, like the hush that follows a summer storm. Adiah's arms, still trembling from the force of emotions, encircled Naomi tightly, unwilling to let go. Naomi's body, warm and fragile, pressed into her chest, and Adiah felt it, the heartbeat of her child. The heartbeat she thought she had lost forever. Tears flowed freely, soaking into fabric, but no one pulled away. Adiah's lips pressed against Naomi's temple, whispering through her sobs, "You're home. You're finally home, my baby." Naomi clung to her, arms tight, fingers desperate, as though afraid the world might steal this moment away. "Mom," she choked, the word raw and foreign on her tongue, but in her heart it felt like it had been waiting there for 20 years. "Mom," she said again, firmer, the word breaking open something long buried. Adiah's breath hitched as the word landed. "Mom." It crashed through her soul and flooded the hollow places with something more powerful than joy, wholeness. "Yes," she whispered fiercely. "Yes, my love. Always." Beside them, Uthan stood, his own face streaked with tears. His chest heaved with the release of emotions too vast to hold. He watched his mother, the woman who had given him a life, and his love, the woman he thought he had lost, and felt his knees weaken beneath the weight of it all. Adiah, sensing his presence, reached out with one arm, her palm open, trembling, inviting. Ethan's body moved before his mind could catch up, and he stepped into the embrace, folding his arms around them both. And in that moment, they weren't fractured pieces of a broken past. They weren't victims of fate's cruel twist. They were family. The storm of tears eventually softened to a fragile, tender stillness. They pulled apart only enough to see each other's faces. Naomi's eyes, still wet, searched Adiah's with a child's question. You waited for me?" Adiah's voice cracked, her fingers brushing Naomi's cheek. "Every single day," she whispered. "Every night, every sunrise. I searched for you. I never stopped." Naomi's throat tightened, and her voice wavered. I didn't know. Her voice broke, and her shoulders trembled with the weight of a stolen past. "I missed you, even when I didn't know you." Adiah's hand, warm and steady, pressed against Naomi's heart. "You were always here," she said softly. "Even when I couldn't find you, you never left me." The silence that followed was not empty but full of everything that had been lost, found, broken, and healed. But within it, a question loomed, an unspoken shadow that had not yet been addressed. Naomi's eyes lowered, her voice trembling again, but now for a different reason. What happens now?" she asked, her gaze flicking briefly to Ethan and then back to Adiah. "I mean," her voice broke with uncertainty, "what are we now?" The air thickened and Ethan's throat worked. His hand, gentle and firm, found Naomi's. "We're us," he said softly, his voice rough but certain. "Nothing has changed. Except everything." His lips pressed into a thin line. "But nothing can take you from me." Naomi's fingers clutched his, her eyes burning. "But we are what we choose to be," Ethan said firmly, his voice trembling but steady. We are not broken by this. We survived it. And his eyes softened. I love you. I choose you. Her breath hitched, her lips parting in disbelief and aching hope. Ethan. Adiah, her eyes shining with both tears and truth, placed her hands on theirs. You have both lived through something impossible, she said, her voice soft but weighted with certainty. But hear me now. Love is not defined by what tries to break it. It's defined by what survives. Her gaze, full of a mother's love, held them both. You are not bound by blood, she said firmly. You are bound by heart. And if your hearts choose each other, then that, her voice cracked, is all that matters. Naomi's lips trembled. But you just found me, she whispered, her voice tight with guilt and fear. What if... Adiah's hand cupped her face, her thumb brushing away a tear. You are my daughter, she said, her voice trembling with love. You are my world, but your heart is yours to give. And if you love him, her voice broke, then I will love you both, as I always have. The silence that followed was different, a silence filled with choice, with understanding, and with something unbreakable. And then, Naomi's fingers, shaken but certain, tightened around Ethan's. Her eyes, shimmering and fragile, lifted to his. I choose you, she whispered, her voice trembling but whole. I always have. Ethan's breath broke from his chest, and the tension that had held him together collapsed as he pulled her into him. Their foreheads touched, their tears mixing, and in that contact was everything. Loss, survival, and the raw, undeniable triumph of love. The days that followed were a blur of healing and discovery. Naomi spent long, slow afternoons with Adiah, the hours unfolding like chapters of a story they were writing together, one made not of lost time, but found time. They cooked together, Adiah teaching Naomi the recipes she had once dreamed of passing down to a daughter she thought she had lost. They walked through the old family home, and Naomi listened, wide-eyed and soft-hearted, as Adiah showed her Lily's nursery, preserved but no longer a shrine of grief. It's not a room for sadness anymore, Adiah whispered. It's a room where hope lived. And now, you're here. Rachel and Thomas, Naomi's adoptive parents, arrived days later. The reunion was tender, filled with tears but no anger. You gave her a life, Adiah said, her voice full of gratitude. You kept her safe when I couldn't. For that, I owe you everything. Rachel's eyes, soft with both joy and sorrow, held Adiah's. We were her beginning, she said quietly. But you are her home. In the following weeks, life did not return to what it was. How could it? Instead, it became something new. Naomi and Ethan chose to postpone their wedding, not out of fear, but out of understanding. We don't want to race through this, Naomi said softly, her fingers entwined with his. We've lived through too much to rush what comes next. Adiah only smiled, her heart full. The best stories, she said, are the ones you write slowly. But then, months later, on a soft golden evening, beneath the very oak tree where Ethan had played as a boy, and where they had found and lost so much, Naomi and Ethan stood once more, surrounded not by fear, but by family. Adiah, dressed in soft silver, stood between Rachel and Thomas, her heart so full she thought it might burst. She watched her daughter, her Lily, walk toward the man who had been her son long before today. And when the vows came, they were not just for each other. They were for all of them. For the family we've lost and found, Naomi said softly, her eyes glistening. For every broken piece that became something whole. For the love that carried us through what should have broken us. Ethan's voice, low and steady, answered, for what we've survived, for what we've built, for what we choose, now and always. When they kissed, it was not an ending. It was a beginning. Adiah felt the tears fall, and she let them, because these were not the tears of loss. They were the tears of everything. Her family was not what she thought it would be. It was more, not perfect, not easy, but whole. And as the sun dipped below the trees, casting the world in a soft golden glow, Adiah closed her eyes, her heart full, and whispered, "Lily, you've come home. And this time, this forever, no one was lost." If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know where you're watching from. Feel free to share this video with your friends. It helps us grow and bring you more amazing stories. And if you're ready for more, check out our other videos. See you in the next one.